Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the DanaBuckler Show. My name is Dana, and I am pleased to welcome my guest today. He is a writer, an editor, a podcaster, and probably the biggest music aficionado I've ever had the opportunity to chat with. Please welcome, first time on the show, David Klein. David, welcome to the DanaBuckler Show. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, David, we're on here. We're going to have a nice conversation. I want to talk about your book, your memoir, Plus One, Getting By on Good Connections in the Analog Age. I had an opportunity to read this over the past week, and I just want to start by saying that you open up with a really, really enticing story about the being at an MTV Music Awards after party in New York City, and you sort of set the stage for, okay, I know what type of book this is going to be. This is going to be really, really fun. And then the book shifts to a pure memoir. And to my surprise and my delight, you spend a lot of time talking about your childhood years. And I'll just go ahead and get this out of the way now, listeners. David, you are one of the best storytellers I have ever read. And so you take the way you take a story and your words, everything just captivated me. So it's a real pleasure to have you on here. Let's talk about the book. Let's talk about you, where you grew up, the whole nine, and I'm just excited to have you.
Wow, that's great. I couldn't ask for a better intro.
Well, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about you first, all right? To give the listeners a little bit about your background and, where you grew up and, a few things like that.
Yeah, I grew up in New Jersey, did not suffer, had a middle-class upbringing. Dad was a doctor. I was sort of in the shadow of a genius older brother, I would say. That was a typical middle child, who was more interested in getting laughs in school than getting good grades. I had some interesting adventures growing up in this age that I talk about as an unsupervised kind of time. And people will tell you that. We just had spent hours risking our lives and running around unwatched. And so it was from that some of these stories, including one about my brother almost getting stuck in this abandoned refrigerator. It was really quite a different time. So finally, I grew up and supposedly did.
Completely understand what you mean by about the sort of the unsupervised era that you grew up in. I'm a couple years younger than you, but also came from sort of the last bastion of that era. I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what the 70s was like for you. Is there anything interesting that you want to share with us about that time period and sort of expand a little bit upon what that era was like?
We were growing up. We were in love with rock and roll and our rock and roll heroes. I used to say goodnight to my Aerosmith poster at night. That was the exciting thing. By sixth grade, we were convincing our parents to take us to Madison Square Garden to see Led Zeppelin, promising that we wouldn't misbehave. Of course, we did. It was a time when there weren't as many choices, so we had to make our own entertainment, making our own mixtapes, and borrowing other kids' records and discovering things from our older brothers, not from the internet. Just you had to know a guy, or you always had a wiser source. So I think we were constantly looking to each other for the next cool thing. And usually for me, it was music.
What was the catalyst for you that made you fall in love with music? What was the moment? Can you pinpoint it?
I think it was the connection that I felt when my parents and I and my siblings would actually be united on this, because our household was fractious. Dad worked hard, mom was frustrated, and it wasn't. It was the thing that really united us. One time, I remember we were driving cross country. And we were just in the car and everyone was fed up with everything. And Johnny Cash's A Boy Named Sue came on. And we were just all kind of rapt, laughing, listening. And suddenly all our troubles kind of melted away. And my early record collection, old folk music and scratchy old Beatles records, that was something where we could independently curate what was going into our brains, and we could play songs over and over, and we could wonder what the words meant. I think I was pretty much hooked by 4 or 5 eventually it sort of developed into the point where I spent 8 years writing a book about number songs.
8 years. Can we talk just briefly about that book? Because I find it a fascinating topic, and we could probably devote a whole podcast episode just to that book. In fact, I'd love to invite you back on to talk about that book. But the brief pitch on that book, I heard on your podcast, I Am the Fly, which there is a link in this episode show notes for you, for the listeners to check out that podcast. I heard the episode where you sort of talk about the inspiration for the book. Could you maybe just talk just briefly about it?
That I can remember that origin story a lot better than that nugget of my music love. But I had a friend who was a young guy, a bartender, and we just started. We had just had a conversation with Lady Gaga, actually, introduced to me as just Steph. And she was playing around town. She gave us some gig flyers. And then I said to my friend, I said, well, you know, if she's playing down there, she's got nowhere to go but up. And then we went inside and we started listening to a CD I made, which included a song called 88 by Anna Domino, which is a beautiful, haunting song. I just said, this has got to be the best 88 song ever. I mean, what could, are there any others? And of course there are. There's a lot of other real. Rocket 88 is a lot of people call it the first rock and roll song ever. So yeah, there's a lot. 88 lines about 44 women is an amazing song. So you could really geek out on this stuff. But I decided to write about number songs from 1 through 99 and 0, and decide, survey each number and then decide which was the ultimate song for that number. So for 8, you had like 8 Miles High, and you had 8 Days a Week, and it was a tough choice. 63, not so tough a choice. Then you had to look harder. And people are always wondering, come on, really? Is there a 63 song? The answer is yes. There are a lot of songs with numbers, every number. So I didn't want to choose one that no one had heard of. So I kind of strove to find either a major artist or a song I considered really good. So it was just this thing that I kept, for over the years as I was raising my kids and working at the local alt weekly and such. It was this project that kept me going. And I just said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start at 1 and I'm going to keep climbing. And eventually I got there.
I have to ask you, before we get into sort of the meat of the book, we live in a world now where you have access to all the music ever made, for the most part. I mean, I have a Spotify Pro account or premium account, and sometimes I'll sit in my car before I leave for work and I'll spend 5 minutes trying to find something to listen to, and I have access to everything. Where have things gone in the with music for you now? As far as in the 70s, 80s, 90s, if you wanted music, you had options. You could go to a record shop, you could watch MTV, you'd listen to the radio. Where do you get your music now? Where is the state of music? And I know that's a very broad question, so I won't ask for a super long response. But for someone like yourself who loves music, it's your passion. Where do you think we are with music?
I will just say, I'll answer the first part, is that I get most of my new music from WFMU, freeform station, one of the only stations of its kind that still exists, where DJs play what they want to play. And I discover new music there all the time. They put up Bandcamp links so you can support the band. That's how I do it usually. I shop for older records. I love vinyl. Used record store. I go to the used section usually. I don't tend to buy brand new releases, which usually cost you $40, $50. It's kind of crazy that you walk into a record store, you could drop $200 and walk out with 4 albums. Yeah. So that's I can stream that stuff. And also there's so much of it. So I just kind of sometimes have to just sort of limit it. So sometimes I say, I'm just going to, I'm going to choose something from my wonderful record collection that I haven't listened to in a while and just say, I should know these songs better. Maybe I could get to know these 2,000 records that I own a little bit better rather than constantly trying to acquire more. And I did that, back in like the Napster era. It was just all about getting more and collecting more. And suddenly you realized you had like every Radiohead bootleg in the world, and it would take you 3 days in a row to listen to them. And it just gets to be kind of silly after a while. And it's like, it's there anyway. You don't need to own it. So I've had to limit my intake a little bit and think and be more intentional.
And will you be on the side that vinyl still sounds the best?
I'll say it because I think I like the process of the intentionality of choosing that record and placing it down and putting the needle on the record, and rather than the more passive streaming thing. If I did a field test, you never know. Someone could play with CD and say that that's pretty warm sounding. I like they sound. A little bit of surface noise is nice. I'm not going to say, oh, it's better with the crackles,
Right.
Sometimes in certain bands, I don't know. Certain bands like Kraftwerk, I don't know. Do I need the vinyl for that? It's all good, I think. I have a lot of digital music as well.
Very good response right there. That was very across the board. I worked as a DJ for sort of a club DJ for about 20 years. And in the first 10 years of it was a pure vinyl experience. And I always loved the way vinyl sounded, especially on a big club sound system. But there's, records skip, they scratch. And when you're in that profession, you need the music to sound perfect every time. So
and the way that the bass sounds have evolved, I just think you might get less distortion with a digital version. I can't prove it, but
absolutely. So we haven't talked about it yet, but your book, The Plus One, Getting By on Good Connections in the Analog Age, which again, there is a link in this episode's show notes for you, the listener, to check this book out. Believe me, I couldn't put it down. But we need to talk about what the plus one means, because we have not mentioned that at all on this episode yet. So I'm going to turn it over to you and sort of, I want to know the inspiration for writing the book, but also we need to know what the plus one means.
The inspiration was I suppose what any memoirist does, the desire to tell one story, to recount for the past, to pull together significant episodes that kind of you can look back on and say, these were the big ones, whether they were ignominious or glorious or somewhere in between. These were the ones that really shaped me. So this was initially called Songs That Shaped Me. And because I sort of divided it into songs somehow, that it was going to be a organizing principle or something. And then it became IDK. I don't know. I am David Klein, whatever. I'll be honest, my really excellent editor friend, Jeff Klingman, who does a talent curator at Knockdown Center in Brooklyn now, doing amazing things. He was the one who suggested the plus one. The plus one is the person who's on the guest list with the person who's invited. I was the plus one for my cousin, Winona Ryder, at some pretty fantastic soirees and big events. And that became an organizing thing because it was a kind of a motif where I would be in these glorious, exciting settings, and then I would be the next day back in the opposite of that, wiping a kid's nose. I was a preschool teacher. I pursued master's in education, so I was kind of in two worlds there, and trying balancing those two and going to the night that the book starts off, as you mentioned, with the 1997 MTV Video Music Awards at which starts at the Four Seasons Hotel. It starts off there, and then about 200 pages later, we go back to that evening, which begins at Winona and Gwyneth Paltrow's apartment that they were sharing at the time, where I'm kind of think I've got the coolest shirt for the night, and they end up forcing me to change my shirt, borrow one from one of their friends. And, so it was kind of that funny feeling of belonging, but not belonging. I'm on the list, but who am I? What am I doing here? Both of those things would sort of play out in the same night.
And the thing is that, like the title says in the book, it's the analog age. It's a different time. It's a different era. I think now, if I was in your shoes in 2025 and I was all of a sudden the plus one with someone, I'll just say real quick, I traveled to Los Angeles about 4 or 5 years ago. I was there with somebody who is relatively well known in the film financing world, and I got to invites to the high-end restaurants and the Soho House in West Hollywood and all these things. And everywhere I went, I was told, keep your phone in your pocket. Keep your phone in your pocket. You cannot take pictures of any of this. So I can tell people stories of it, but I wasn't able to prove to anybody that any of this happened.
Right.
This is very similar to your situation in the 90s, but you were probably not restricted from if you would have had a phone, you probably would have documented. When I say phone, I mean camera, everybody. This is what I mean by that. You would have documented it a little bit more.
I did, and I did on one occasion. I mean, I was really prepared for this. The time that we went to we saw U2 at Yankee Stadium, and I had I had one roll of film, and you forget what that was like. And I used up most of it because they were playing in the stadium when we walked in, and there was no one. It was the middle of they were doing a sound check. So there we are in the empty Yankee Stadium, save for U2, their tech crew. And it was so surrealistic that I just it snapped up a million pictures because like, who would ever believe it? Who's going to believe this? So yeah. And then we got on stage, I took a few more, and that was pretty much it. And it's, I guess it was before the time where you would say, can I take a picture with you? Now it's so common, but if I had more film, I mean, I could have photographed, the infamous Phil Spector and Tatum O'Neal and John McEnroe and Lenny Kravitz and Peter Gabriel. And, it was just the VIP riser was insane that night. But I had to just kind of make do with telling my friends about it the next day. That was pretty much it. Nowhere to post, no one to brag to, besides your immediate circle.
When you first write about Winona in the book, you tell the story about the winter storm and over, family overstaying their welcome and just I mean, I laughed out loud just on the part where your mom thought they left and they kept coming back. And first it was the hat, then it was she left her copy of West Side Story, but you wrote obviously very kindly about her. And I'm wondering, you could tell listeners a little bit about what that relationship was like. This is pre, her becoming one of the biggest actresses in the world. So just talk a little bit about what that relationship was like growing up with her being your first cousin.
They were just very cool. I basically thought her father was a movie star, or he seemed, Uncle Mike, her dad, was to me like a movie star presence. The visits, they were from California. When they would visit, it was just so really exciting for me because he was a hippie. I called him my hippie uncle. In first and second grade, I bragged about having a hippie uncle. This is before even she was born. So then when she came along, she was just absolutely a delight. I mean, she's a delightful human being who was obviously just had a spark that not everybody has. I would hear stories about how Mike and Cindy they'd go out somewhere in San Francisco and then they'd be on a bus and somebody would just say, hey, would want to invite them to dinner, or she was like a person magnet. So I was super, the formative time when we started we bonded over music, and I started sending her my mixtapes in the mail. That's how she discovered the Replacements. So I can take credit for that. Yeah. It's even in the Bob Mayer, great author, who wrote a back cover blurb for me, who wrote this definitive book on the Replacements, actually, confirmed that it was, quote, an older cousin who turned her on to the Replacements for the first time. So I will take credit for that. That's one thing I can claim in truth, that I've touched history in a sort of significant way.
Take me through your journeys into the 80s, because in the 80s is where things are going to start to, like for Winona, things are going to start to really move rapidly. Where are you in this time period?
In the 80s, I mean, it's, college, mid 80s, I graduated from college and she was a rising star. And this is around when, like say the Beetlejuice era, Mermaids, that sort of era. She was just a really, everyone was very excited. She was still not such a phenom. I remember I took her to a concert in Central Park, free concert in Central Park. These things are completely just overrun by people, and she wasn't afraid of being recognized or anything. And she wasn't, and it was just fun. And a couple of years later, it's a totally different deal. I'm she invites me to go to U2, and Paul McGinnis, the manager, picks us up in his car, and we walk in through, the chain link fence at the stadium, parts for us, and we're taken there, and it's just completely. I'm being taken along. She's the star.
Yeah.
I'm not like the music expert anymore, and I even talk about how, by the time she's like living with Gwyneth, they're making fun of my musical taste, and and she no longer needs my cassettes anymore. So, I saw that happen, and then, our relationship, a round girl interrupted, our relationship got a little interrupted. She was off becoming a producer, and it was, and it was it was rough for a little while because we did lose touch, and, I'm happy to say we're back in touch in a big way now, and it's really, I'm proud of her. It's been a long haul. The night I got married, she couldn't show up because why? Well, she was hosting SNL, so I figured that's about as good an excuse as you can have for missing your cousin's wedding.
Absolutely.
So I forget that.
Absolutely. And I know the SNL was really important to her. And this was something that, you referenced in the book. I want to circle back to the Beetlejuice era just for a moment. Okay. Beetlejuice, 1988, directed by Tim Burton. Tim Burton's first film's Pee-wee's Big Adventure from 1985. What are your memories about the time, during that time when she's making this film? Because it has to be on paper one of the most insane premises for a film. And to be filming it has to be like, what are we doing here? And I saw Beetlejuice in the theater as a 10-year-old in 1988, and it's still a movie that resonates with people of all ages to this day. But what's the vibe like during that time?
Well, it was. I just know that no one was really sure about this movie, and my uncle was in touch with me. I think it was filmed in Vermont or in New England, and they just really didn't know what this thing was going to be. He wasn't established. And that's a crazy premise. Just like Scissorhands, there's the story that Gary Oldman tells about how he read the script and it opens and there's all bright suburbia and then there's a castle on the hill and he goes, what the hell? This is crazy. And then he says eventually he saw it. He's like, in 2 minutes, he said, oh, I see now. So it was not a done deal, and he wasn't a sure thing. I just remember Noni being at one of our parties, and she had the Lydia hair. She was wearing a Batman shirt, from the Batman movie. It was just kind of very much of its time. I remember that she was excited to be working, but it was a far cry from where she ended up just a few years later.
What was it like the first time seeing her on the big screen?
Like, she was so adorable in Lucas.
Yeah.
I mean, I loved it. I remember telling her she didn't like her speaking voice in it. And I said, no, you sound like a clarinet. She had this really beautiful tonality, I found, when in that movie, the way she spoke. It's very, very just natural. And I remember that they kept writing her part bigger, because she just stole every scene. It's still a movie. That movie still gets me. I really liked it. Yeah,
Lucas. That's a film that I'm really due for a rewatch. Corey Haim and Winona Ryder. Yeah. That's just that era of film. It's and it's something I speak passionately about on my show all the time. Is the lost era of cinema that we don't really get as much anymore. Although, since we're on the subject, I did enjoy Beetlejuice, the new one. So I did.
Yeah.
That was
rare sequel that actually seems to be that had enough working for it that it was worth doing. And I know that Noni and Jenna Ortega got along really well, and I think they're kind of in touch, and who knows where that'll go. But
so I have to ask, because we're your memoir, and I don't want to gloss over everything, but just some points that, when you were a kid, talking about, I don't want to spoil it. You have an incident involving your eye, and you have, I'm just going to say it. I know I want people to read the book, but can you tell the Led Zeppelin story real quickly? Just the Led Zeppelin concert story, because my jaw was on the floor. First of all, I love Led Zeppelin. I have the song Remains the Same, the concert. I have that on every format possible. I love watching it. Yeah. But for someone to hear it from somebody who was there, can you just tell the Led Zeppelin story, please. Then I want to get.
I'll just say that they were our heroes.
Yeah.
They were the coolest, the hardest, the most decadent, sexy kind of. You just had so many everything, and the music was so epic, and so yeah, I people still can. I still sound really old when I say I actually saw them, and so yeah, so we saw them at Madison Square Garden. My friend is a pyrotechnic enthusiast. Actually, more than that. The eye injury that you mentioned earlier was caused by the same friend who, had this propensity to take risks with other people's lives and stuff. So about, 20 minutes, 25 minutes into the concert, he breaks out an M80 shooter, which is like a firework that shoots an M80 really, really high in the air, and then it sort of explodes somewhere on its descent. So this is between songs. So Buddy shoots the M80, huge explosion, and then a chorus of boos, like resounding boos from the entire stadium. So I'm sitting there wanting to disappear. And then it gets worse because Robert Plant saunters to the mic and he just says, boo, boo. So we were booed by our favorite band at the world's most, storied sports arena. And it was absolutely, it was mortifying as could be. And I, filled me with like all sorts of crazy emotions, wanting to kill my friends and whatnot. And then like at the end for the encore, the M80 shooter was gone, obviously, but we still had some sparklers, like some really, really super grade sparklers. Well, so they shot, those things, which were basically like a beacon of light. So Garden security quickly descended. They got tossed out. I was happy to see that. Justice was served. But yeah, you just never know how it's going to feel to be booed by Robert Plant in public.
That was, again, jaw was on the floor reading that story because thank you for sharing that. And that story, among so many other incredible stories, are in the book, which leads me to my next question. Yeah. How do you decide what stories make it into this memoir? I mean, some of them are no-brainers. You have to tell them Winona Ryder's your cousin, and there's so many stories that are tied to that. And there are some really interesting things you talk about, and you're also incredibly candid about things that you've done. And I applaud that. You're just, you don't hold back. You say, this was the period, and this is what we did. This is what we did back then. So how do you decide what stories make it into the book?
I think, well, one thing that I would say about any book project is that you need to work with an editor. You need someone to tell you, I don't know if, maybe this goes on too long, or I don't know if you need this. I think that was helpful. And also you have to kill your darlings, as they say. And I think that you have to choose the best one, the ones that's the most compelling. I kind of ran through my dating, my speed dating era by just choosing the most piquant examples. I could go on a lot about those misadventures. In fact, my first stories that I ever wrote were just basically all about misbegotten dates. I mean, just millions of them, in every possible way. And, but I just felt like, and I can get that across without, I felt like I wanted to keep a light touch. And I think that's, I think the reason you were able to take it in is because I was judicious about editing it and keeping things moving along, really, even if I could have gone on longer.
Okay. How long did the writing process take from the moment you said, I'm going to do this to publication?
I'll tell you what, I found an email to my sister from 2016.
Okay.
Where I said, I'm starting to get some of this stuff in order, starting to write the story of my life. After that, so that's 9 years ago. But then, and then I started interviewing my parents. I had a lot of back and forth with my parents about like where I was born. Like the second chapter is on the Army base where I was born, where Jimi Hendrix happened to be a paratrooper. And I found a way to sort of connect those stories.
And just to touch on that Jimi Hendrix story, my God. First of all, I didn't know he was part of the Airborne. Didn't know he was a paratrooper. Touching, poignant moment of that is when he actually gets his guitar sent to him. I think that's incredible. But the connection that your father has with him, I thought was also pretty incredible. So that's that. Just again, these are the kind of stories you're going to find in this book.
Well, yeah, the connection. My father was the clinic physician at this Army base, and Jimmy was there. And I did research, and Jimmy he went to the dental clinic. So, and apparently on his 25th jump, he injured his ankle. And so I'm thinking, well, he would have had to go to the clinic for that. And so, of course, I was like, Dad, did you lay hands on Jimi Hendrix? Dad, being a very rational medical man, said, I couldn't possibly entertain that hypothetical. I like to think that he did. But yeah, so I was born around the same time that Jimi Hendrix's father sent him his proper guitar, because the ones he was using on the Army base were from the company store and they were terrible and he couldn't play it anymore. So it arrived somewhere. He wrote to his dad in January, and I conjecture that perhaps he got his guitar the same day that my mother got me.
I love that. I love those connections. I just had a blast reading this. So let me ask you, a lot of the stories in this book are happening in the 90s. A lot of this is happening there. So tell me, what I'd love to know is, going into the last decade of the 20th century, going into the 90s, which again is, I'll say, my stomping ground, is my formidable years. That's when I was a teenager, and I think I turned 21 in 99. So I remember this era extremely well. It's also the end of an era as far as the analog age meeting the digital age. So I want you to kind of just take me a little bit through the early 90s, and what are you doing in your life? You mentioned you were teaching, but where are you?
Left teaching. I started to get, my brother started this, was a kingpin at MTV Europe. They did this really avant-garde show called Buzz. I went out to London. That was with Mark Pellington, who went on to direct the Jeremy video for Pearl Jam. So all these really talented video directors and people were in this world. And I just thought that, I've got to do something a little more, I just got to get out of the classroom. Eventually, I made my way to a literary agency like ICM, which was the hottest one in the world, really. Or anyway, it was a premier talent agency, and their literary agency especially had all kinds of people. So I was surrounded by all sorts of talented writers, editors. My brother was over there. My Noni had her career going. My best friend, roommate in New York, was going out with Marissa Tomei, and she was on the cusp. My friend was starting clubs all over New York. His brother was starring in a movie. Everybody was doing something exciting, and so I was trying to keep up best I could. But eventually, it sort of peaked. I think that whole 90s thing, it kind of peaked with this MTV Video Awards thing, where it kind of went from the sublime to the ridiculous. And then kind of after that, we kind of lost touch for a while. And then things got real for me. I found a love of my life that was super significant. And it was happening when my cousin was having her struggles. So it was all a really strange little flip-flop, where suddenly I felt like, I'm pretty happy with the life I have. I've got a lot to do, a lot of really neat things, but I don't feel like I'm on the outside looking in anymore.
That's incredible. I have to ask though, as a music lover, where were you musically in the early 90s? Because it was such a monumental shift that was happening, and you're somebody who just studies it, consumes it, it's your passion. I have to know where your head was in the early 90s with music.
Definitely, the big Nirvana and Liz Phair, a lot of British British rock. I went for the electronica stuff for a while.
Yeah.
I used to love having parties in Manhattan, and there's that everything had a beat. It had those kind of beats at that point. Chemical Brothers
Yep.
were huge. I remember the first time I heard Funk Soul Brother, and I cannot believe how many times that it's insanely repetitious, but still kind of wonderful. So yeah, I wasn't that. I think I've gotten a little bit more. I discovered so much music also writing the Number Song book, because when you're like trying to research, you have to listen to these songs too. So I kind of I feel like I've found my way through traditional channels, and then through my little strange little interests.
You don't live in the New York area anymore. You're in North Carolina. How is that? Just tell me how. I mean, I'm talking to you from just outside Tampa, Florida.
Yeah.
You were in the epicenter of the world for a very long time, and in this book, which I encourage everyone to read, you tell some amazing stories. Amazing stories. Tell me about the decision to leave that. I mean, I know the reason, but tell the listener sort of the decision to leave that.
Yeah, being in the epicenter is great when you have a pair of 1-year-old twins. Suddenly all the proximity doesn't matter anymore, because you're just trying to make things, keep things together. It was tough. The apartment just felt like it was getting smaller by the day, and we weren't even getting to enjoy the New York stuff. It was just the bad New York stuff, like trying to push your kids in a stroller down a snowy sidewalk to get them to school on time. It was just a lot of hassle. And then my wife was recruited down to Duke to work in the financial aid, and her folks live down here. So it was kind of the perfect place to move to have two little rambunctious boys. And it was definitely an adjustment, of course, but I think I've had so many cool years in New York. I was ready to move on, and I got married at 40. 42, I had my kids, so it was I had plenty of fun, plenty of New York time. It's a lot. New York, living in a small apartment when you're young and single, is fantastic, but it's harder to maintain as a parent, and I don't regret it. I still get up there pretty often, and sometimes it's really overwhelming to me, because I'm just not used to it. So it takes me a little while to get used to being in New York a little bit, but I sure love to get back up there.
I was up there a week and a half ago, just for a few days, and I've only been there a handful of times. Walking at 6:30 in the morning to go get a cup of coffee off 36th and 6th Avenue, and I'm just saying to myself, the city is alive. But I don't know if I could live there. But this was something that I'm always sort of, for someone that has lived there and experienced all that you've experienced. It's incredible. And I've been to your neck of the woods, the Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, that whole area several times, and it's beautiful area. It really is.
It is, but you know what? Yeah. When it doesn't pump with life.
Yeah.
I worked in Durham for about 8 years. Downtown Durham, lots of businesses and all, and you never see people on the sidewalk. No. You just never do. And it's like, and they, you read prices are going up and gentrification's happening, but it just doesn't have the people or the pulse. And I definitely miss that. And sometimes I'm just like, wow, things have really, really changed in terms of pace. But it was the thing to do. I mean, my kids are now in college, so now we can start thinking about whether we want to stay here or find some other way to live. Now we can do that. But for bringing up kids, it was well worth it.
Can you talk just a little bit about your podcast, I Am the Fly, and sort of the inspiration to start that? And again, for the listeners, just want to remind you, there's a link in this episode show notes to bring you right to it. I started listening to it the other day. I actually messaged you. I said, I got to follow him on Twitter. I got to follow him on X. I'm so used to saying that. Yeah, it is what it is. Yeah. But it was the first thing I had to tell you was I'm really looking forward to talking to you. By the way, I've been listening to your podcast, and not only is it great storytelling, but we talked about this before we started recording this episode, that the post-production is really, really good on it. And as someone who does podcast editing for the better part of 12 years, I was the first question I asked you was, hey, did you edit this yourself? Because this is really good. So talk a little bit about I Am the Fly.
I Am the Fly was the result of me not being able to get a book deal. I wrote this memoir, queried a lot of people, came away with the conclusion that the kind of memoirs that people are looking to publish now are usually about who has the most fucked up childhood.
Yeah.
My father was a cross-dressing evangelist who kept me in the basement, and then you know what I mean? That kind of stuff. That's what sells. Not the story of a middle-aged dude like myself who had some scrapes and, no, my story is like the Wonder Years crossed with Dazed and Confused. It's those years. It's that sort of a feeling. And so I did the podcast just during the pandemic when I just felt like I need to do something to keep them going crazy, and this could be fun. Of course, I had to learn GarageBand, which is the platform that you put it all together with. And since I had music and some sound samples, I had whatever footsteps coming down staircases, that kind of stuff. Those little fun things. I was like, oh, I got to do that. I want to do that. I've always wanted to embellish a little bit. Like my book has I worked with an illustrator named Chris Williams, who I met at this Alt Weekly, who's a wonderful, hardworking, one-of-a-kind illustrator. So each chapter has an illustration by Chris. I had illustrations in my numbers and charts and infographics in my number song book. I always like to add another element. So between narrating the story and adding in music and sound effects, it was a major undertaking. And then you've got your dogs barking outside and any other thing, and then you realize, oh, it's out of sync, or what happened there? The sound dropped out. There's just a million things. So that kept me, I got some nice feedback on that, and then people were saying, are you going to publish it? And I wasn't even sure if I was. And then I said, I want to. And so having done it, having written it, and then having narrated it, and then did a final, the final version that is the +1. It's like I lived my life three extra times.
Yeah.
So it's definitely, it was an interesting process, and I think it's a better book for having been a podcast first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And by the way, just side note here, the Wonder Years crossed with Dazed and Confused. Earlier this morning, I was having coffee with my girlfriend, and I was telling her that I'm, getting ready to have this conversation. And I just kept saying, I don't know how to describe this book. I don't know how. The way David finds himself in all of these really incredible, unique situations, I cannot find the way to describe this. So thank you. Here we are towards the end of the episode, and you nailed it. I can't wait to tell her when we're done. It's the Wonder Years mixed with Dazed and Confused. So thank you for saying that.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
That's perfect.
Nice to have two movies you can really point to, or two things you can really point to that really makes sense.
It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. So before we wrap up, I have to ask you, music-wise, real quick, what do you listen to these days? What's on? I guess we don't call them mixtapes anymore. What's on your playlist? I think that's what the kids call it these days, is the playlist.
Couple of bands, the Bug Club,
okay,
Cleaners from Venus, the Lemon Twigs, these super ridiculously talented brothers, the D'Addario brothers. They're fantastic. Phosphorescent, Swamp Dog, Real Estate, Jessica Pratt, the Pesos. Who else? The Tubs. The Tubs are a British band. So yeah, those are, and a lot of those I've gotten from listening to WFMU. As you can see, yeah, I'm not listening to the big pop divas.
Sure.
So yeah, it's more, I guess I still have this sort of indie pop, indie rock kind of thing. I'm always going to be attracted to melody, harmony, humor, as opposed to, I suppose I've got limited patience for certain kinds of right up to the moment pop right now.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean I can't dig Billie Eilish or something.
Sure. Absolutely. And
I'm happy, man.
Yeah, exactly. No, listen, I get it. I have a whole theory about streaming music and how it's destroyed. Anyway, we can have that conversation another time. We were talking about your book here. The book is, once again, is The Plus One: Getting By on Good Connections in the Analog Age. It's written by David Klein. David, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for just taking a little time out of your day to talk about this amazing memoir that you wrote. I am going to be preaching the gospel of The Plus One to everyone I know, and I really hope my listeners out there stop what they're doing, order the book, and would love to invite you back on to, have some additional conversations down the road. So thank you so much for being on here.
Dana, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed our talk. I'm excited, and I'm pleased that you responded to it so well, and that we had a good meeting of the minds on it, kind of.
Absolutely. Perfect. My name is DanaBuckler. You've been listening to The DanaBuckler Show. You can follow me on social media, Instagram at The DanaBuckler. I'm on X at DanaBuckler Show. You can email me, TheDanaBucklerShow@gmail.com. And for everybody else, thank you so much, and we will talk soon. David, thank you.
Thank you, Dana.